Have you ever noticed something strange about learning? You can watch a video, understand everything in it, and feel completely confident that you've learned something. But the next day, it's gone. The explanation made sense. You followed every step. Yet somehow the knowledge disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. But then something different happens with other experiences. A skill you practice repeatedly suddenly becomes easier. A language phrase you hear often becomes automatic. A movement you struggled with suddenly feels natural. So why does this happen? Why do some experiences vanish from memory, while others permanently change your brain? The answer is not intelligence, and it is not motivation. The answer is repetition, but not in the way most people imagine. Repetition is not just practice. It is the biological signal that tells your brain something is worth keeping. To understand why repetition works, we first need to understand something fundamental about the brain. Your brain is not a storage device. It is a dynamic network. Information is not stored as files. It is stored as patterns of activity between neurons. Neurons are specialized cells designed to transmit information. Your brain contains roughly 8 to 6 billion of them. Each neuron connects to thousands of others through structures called synapses. When neurons communicate, electrical signals travel through these connections. This communication creates networks of activity, and these networks are the foundation of everything you know. When you experience something new for the first time, a specific pattern of neurons activates. Signals travel across synapses, neurotransmitters are released, but initially this network is unstable. The connections are weak. Signals travel inefficiently. The brain is essentially experimenting with a new pathway. This is why first exposure rarely creates lasting learning. The signal passed through the system once, but the brain has not yet decided that the pathway is important. So the network remains fragile. But something different happens when the same pathway activates repeatedly. Each time neurons fire together, their connection strengthens slightly. More neurotransmitter receptors appear at the synapse. Electrical signals begin traveling more efficiently. Communication improves. This process is known as synaptic plasticity. Plasticity simply means the ability to change. Your brain constantly adjusts the strength of connections between neurons based on how often those connections are used. There is a famous phrase in neuroscience that summarizes this process. Neurons that fire together wire together. When two neurons activate repeatedly at the same time, the synapse connecting them becomes stronger. Over time, this repeated activation transforms a fragile pathway into a stable circuit. This is the biological reason repetition works. But repetition does something else as well. It increases efficiency. Early in learning, many neurons may be involved in performing a task. Signals move slowly, mistakes occur frequently. The system is still figuring out the most efficient pathway. With repeated activation, the brain reorganizes. Unnecessary connections weaken, important pathways strengthen. The network becomes streamlined. Signals travel faster. Less energy is required. This process is sometimes compared to building a road system. At first, the path is narrow and difficult to travel. But as it is used more frequently, it becomes wider and easier to follow. Eventually, it becomes the fastest route available. The brain is constantly performing this kind of optimization, strengthening pathways that are used often, removing those that are not. And this reveals something important about learning. Learning is not simply adding information. Learning is reorganizing the brain. But repetition alone is not always enough. Another factor determines whether repeated signals actually produce lasting change: attention. Your brain receives far more information than it can store. Every second, thousands of sensory signals enter the nervous system. Most of them are ignored. Attention acts like a filter. When you focus on something, specific neurochemicals are released in the brain. These chemicals signal that the information is important. One of the key chemicals involved is acetylcholine. This neurotransmitter increases the sensitivity of neurons, making them more responsive to incoming signals. In other words, attention prepares the brain for learning. Without attention, signals are weak. And weak signals rarely produce structural changes in neural circuits. Emotion can also amplify this process. Emotionally significant experiences activate regions of the brain involved in survival. When this happens, memory formation becomes stronger. This is why emotionally intense events often become vivid memories. But even with attention and emotion, repetition remains essential. One experience may activate a pathway, but repeated experiences stabilize it. This is why practice is so powerful. Practice repeatedly activates the same neural circuit. Each activation strengthens the connection slightly. Over time, those small changes accumulate. Eventually, the circuit becomes stable enough to operate reliably, and this leads to something interesting. Learning often feels difficult at the beginning. Signals move slowly. Errors are common. The pathway is still forming. But difficulty is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that the brain is building a new circuit. As repetition continues, the system reorganizes. Signals travel faster. Fewer neurons are required. And what once felt difficult becomes easier. This is the moment when learning becomes visible. But the biological changes started long before that moment. Understanding this process leads to an important shift in perspective. Many people assume learning ability is determined mostly by intelligence. But intelligence alone does not create neural circuits. Experience does. Focused attention, repeated activation, effortful practice. These are the forces that reshape the brain. This also explains why passive consumption rarely produces strong learning. Watching information activates neural circuits temporarily, but temporary activation is not the same as structural change. For a circuit to strengthen, the brain must generate the signal repeatedly, not just observe it. Activities like recall, practice, and problem-solving force the brain to activate the circuit itself. And that activation is what drives plasticity. Once you understand this, learning becomes less mysterious. It becomes biological. Signals become circuits. Circuits become networks. Networks become skills. And perhaps the most important insight is this. Your brain is not fixed. Even in adulthood, neural circuits continue to change. New connections form. Old ones weaken. The brain remains adaptable throughout life. This ability is called neuroplasticity, and it is the biological foundation of learning. But this raises an interesting question. If repetition strengthens neural circuits, why do some behaviors eventually run automatically? Why do certain actions stop requiring conscious effort? Because eventually repeated learning becomes something else. It becomes habit. In the next video, we'll explore how repeated neural activity stabilizes into automatic behavior, how the brain decides which patterns become habits, and why habits can be incredibly powerful once they form. Because understanding how learning works is only the first step. Understanding how learning becomes automatic is where things become even more interesting. I'll see you there.